Good day, young philosophers. We're picking up where our last video left off when we were talking about the concept of virtue in Aristotle, which is this kind of character, or being the kind of person who can do excellent, beautiful kalan actions with ease and pleasure, right? And our last video, we were just talking about three components to virtue. The virtuous person has a special kind of understanding, a special kind of character, and a special kind of skill that sets them apart from other people. And we're going to examine in particular these three components in this video, and we're also going to look at some particular examples of virtue of character. Some really nice little things that Aristotle brings out, especially in Book 2, Chapter 7, but all over the place in the Nicomachean Ethics. So let's first talk about understanding, and actually in a related way, we're going to talk about the skill of the virtuous person, right? And so to understand the skill of, and understanding and the skill of the virtuous person, it helps us to go back to thinking about the two kinds of knowledge that exist in actions. One of the reasons why we were talking about voluntary actions back in our first video is because it helps set up this very important distinction between two different kinds of knowing that, again, exist in action. So let's think about these two kinds of knowing. All right, so first we talked about a certain kind of knowledge that had to do with what we ought to do, the ends of our actions, and that was what we called a kind of universal knowledge. And then when we talked about the knowledge that had to do with particular circumstances, the word came out of the way, the who, what, when, where, and how of our actions, that was particular knowledge. Now, we already said that someone is, at least in terms of voluntariness, if we were to recap, that someone would be blamed if they failed to understand some universal things, but they in terms of particular knowledge, that's the only place where you might pardon someone for making a mistake, right? It's very plausible that someone would know what they ought to do in general, but not see how to do it in these particular circumstances. And that's really where our concept of virtue comes in, right? The virtuous person, right? The virtuous person, it not only has this universal knowledge, because according to Aristotle, just about everyone has this main universal ideas of what we ought to do. What the virtuous person really excels at, the virtuous person excels at grasping how those universal principles are to be enacted in these particular circumstances. One of the things that, say, if we use the analogy to skill again, that makes Michael Jordan so impressive as a basketball player, is that in the heat of the moment in a game, he sees exactly what he ought to do. Contrasted with someone like me, I played basketball when I was middle school, never really in high school and stuff like that, and I just play for fun every so often. But one of the things that I found is I never really understood where I needed to be on the court, and really I never wasn't able to read exactly how the game was unfolding in front of me, right? Michael Jordan, he can almost understand people's moves before they make them, right? As a defensive player and as an offensive player. He's a special kind of understanding when it comes to the game. And it's not just in universals. If you want to be a good basketball player, you can't just read a book about basketball. You have to play it, and it's all about the particulars. So the virtuous person, right, is amazing in how they grasp the particulars. If we take this back to skill, remember how we, in the skill of the virtuous person, the virtuous person is able to apply what they need to do in general to themselves, right? And so in the last video, at the end of the video, I mentioned that there's sort of like a difference between, say, a soldier and a child, right? And part of the difference between a soldier and a child is in their particular skill sets, right? They've got these different sets of skills, but in the knowledge that a virtuous person has is they're able to see based on their own skill. Like based on me, on who I am and what I am capable of doing, on the kinds of strengths I have and all my weaknesses, exactly how I can achieve this great end, right? And so you might think, and we'll talk about this we'll talk about this a little bit more, but say we were talking about generosity. Do you guys agree? Generosity. I almost spelled it wrong there. Do you agree that we ought to be generous? I hope you do. I hope you think that we should be generous. But what if you? I guarantee you, almost everyone here has encountered someone who is begging, right? Someone who maybe you thought was homeless, maybe they weren't homeless, but they were begging for maybe money or food or something like that. What did you do in that circumstance? Did you give them money or food, right? I've had this discussion. We had a nice discussion with students many, many times, and I found students often say, no, I didn't give them anything. Why? Because I was afraid. I was afraid that maybe they would attack me. I've heard people say, oh, no, I don't give people money because they're just going to use it for wrong things like drugs or something like that. And so we can come up with all kinds of excuses. Another reason that we might not give money to someone might because of a matter of character. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But it might be like you're just too afraid to act on your belief that you ought to be generous. And that's a thing too. But I would argue, at least if we were to study this in terms of understanding and skill, one of the reasons why people aren't generous with people who are begging in particular is because they're not sure how. They're not sure how you can actually be generous in this circumstance. How is it that I can deal with the fact that I need to be careful, I need to be safe in this environment? And also, how do I know that I'm going to give them something that would actually be good for them? Because admittedly, it would be terrible if you gave money to someone and the only thing they were going to use it for is things that were going to hurt themselves. And so fundamentally, part of the challenges is to figure out how to accomplish the thing you want to achieve. How can I be generous to someone who's begging for money or food on the street? The virtuous person would in some ways be able to see how to do it. And I had some very good friends. One of my great friends, John, we were musicians together. We did all kinds of stuff. But on several occasions, we did some work where we were helping some people out, and I was always impressed with how he was able to engage with people who sometimes made me nervous. And he just saw how to engage and how to help and how to have a conversation. And I just couldn't see how to do it. And it wasn't just a matter of fear; it was just a matter of skill. That he had a certain skill. Now, in the knowledge dimension here is to say, knowing myself, how can I accomplish this great end? Based on the kind of person I am. We'll examine that some more too later on. All right, so that's in some sense the fundamentals of the virtue. Virtue is related to understanding. That's fundamentally not so much about the universals, but it's in the virtuous person is able to see in the particulars how to accomplish a particular goal. We'll come back to that. Now let's turn quickly to different kinds of character. And this actually is, I think, for Aristotle, one of the most important distinctions for us to consider. And perhaps I should have started with this. I hope you lasted long enough in the video to see this, because I think this is crucial, right? When we're looking at the character of the virtuous person, again, this isn't so much about their understanding or skill, but the kind of way that they act on their understanding, right? That we'll see virtue is a sort of in between two vices, right? So we always say that there's a difference between virtue and vice, but for Aristotle, there's vices on either side, especially when it comes to moral virtues, that you might have a vice of too much or a vice of too little. We'll come back to that. But when we talk about the virtues, it's possible that you're somewhere in between virtue and vice, right? So let's say, am I a generous person? I don't know that I completely am. I strive to be generous, but I'm not necessarily generous. Does that mean that I'm a vicious person? That I'm really just like a stingy person, right? Who's unwilling to give anyone anything? Well, no, that's not necessarily the case. There's something sort of in between virtue and vice. And for Aristotle, he's going to say someone who's kind of close to virtue, and further away from vice, but not quite virtuous. He calls that person a continent person, or continence. This is a continent person. And on this side, you can actually have a continent person too, as we'll see. And we'll talk more about this, how virtue is sort of a mean between two extremes. But then moving out away from virtue towards vices, there's what Aristotle calls the incontinent person, or incontinence, right? And again, that can exist on either side, right? Incontinence. So what do we mean by these two types of things, right? Well, fundamentally, it has to do with the kind of person who isn't virtuous. And what was a virtuous person? We fundamentally started by saying that virtue has to do with someone who does excellent actions, beautiful actions with ease and with pleasure, right? That with apparent ease and with apparent pleasure. So let's contrast that with the vicious person. What really makes a vicious person a vicious person? Well, in some ways, the vicious person also does actions with ease and pleasure, but they don't do the Calon action. Remember, Calon is beautiful. They do the what? They do the ugly action, right? They do ugly things with ease and pleasure. So the virtuous person and the vicious person are very similar in this respect, because they both have ease and somehow pleasure. But the vicious person takes pleasure in something that's ugly, that's hurtful, that's harmful, that's painful, right? While the virtuous person takes pleasure in things that are, Aristotle, at least in his depiction here, is things that they ought to, things that are beautiful, right? All right. So what's in between? Well, for Aristotle, then we have, again, continence and incontinence as being a kind of in-between virtue and vice, right? Continence and incontinence are like this. It's like, say I want to be a generous person, but when I see that, like, for instance, one of the things I've done in the past, and I've heard a lot of people talk about this, is they have some kind of gift card. Like you might have a gift certificate to like Dunkin' Donuts. And I've done this as well. I go to Philadelphia every single day, and I encounter people in suburban station almost daily, and ever so often people ask me for stuff, and I do carry a Dunkin' Donuts gift card or two, not worth a ton of money, but in my wallet just in case I encounter someone who I think actually seems legit hungry and I feel comfortable to share something with them, right? So, but when oftentimes though, there's all this mixture of frustration between even what I know I ought to do and what I'm sort of willing to do. There's a conflict between my knowledge and my character. Remember that there's three components. There's your understanding, your skill, but then there's your character. So I can understand that I ought to help this person, maybe give them a gift card, but sometimes there's all kinds of fears and desires to just get home that can get in the way. So the continent person is the kind of person who does sort of what I'll just call the right action, right? Which you might also call the calendar, the beautiful action. They do the right action, just like the virtuous person, but they do it with a struggle, right? And they do it with regret, right? The continent person has this mixture, right, of this intellectual aiming at the good action, but then also this kind of internal desire for something else, right? It's just as another example, not just thinking of generosity. Say we're thinking about food. Like say, like right now, I've been sacrificing sugar in my life. Can you believe it? For the last 4 weeks or so, I've had nothing, just about nothing that had added sugars, maybe like sugars and fruit and stuff like that. But ever so often, like my kids, the other day we had a pie, and my kids were eating that pie, and I wanted that pie, right? And I knew in my mind that I made a commitment. I was gonna bam, I'm not gonna eat anything with added sugars in it right now. And I really, really, really wanted to eat that pie, right? But at the same time, I had made this commitment, and I knew it would be more beautiful and excellent to keep my commitment. So I was at best, in this case, perhaps a continent or an incontinent person, right? So the continent person is going to go through that struggle, but they're going to sort of win out, right? They're going to see the pie and they'll win out. The incontinent person, they do what we'll call sort of the wrong action, and perhaps the ugly could also be used here, though it's not always that strong, but they do the wrong action, and they also, though, do it with a struggle and regret. So if I, encountering the delicious pie, decide to eat it, then I would be what Aristotle would call an incontinent person. I wouldn't be vicious, because why? I'm not taking ease and pleasure in doing the wrong thing in this circumstance, but I still, and what shows that I'm not vicious, that I still am going through a struggle. I'm struggling with trying to do the right thing, right? The continent person would be me if I went through that struggle and I managed to not eat the pie. And I'm willing to admit, at least in this circumstance, that I was continent. I did hold out, and I succeeded in my struggle, and I still did the right action, right? But even then, I wasn't the virtuous person. Why? Because there was struggle, right? And regret. We didn't talk about the regret part. The regret is this. If I was, I did not eat the pie when I encountered it, and yet there was some regret in me because I really wish I had eaten the pie. It was delicious. And you might think back on your actions about times that you struggled with doing the right thing and you succeeded in doing the right thing, but you almost regret it. Like, oh my gosh, it would have been great to do the wrong thing, right? And vice versa. Say you struggle with doing the right thing and you end up doing the wrong action. And there's always regret there too, because you realize, that's more often a kind of regret that we encounter, the regret of, of the shame in doing the thing that we knew was wrong, yet we did it anyway, right? All this actually connects in kind of a beautiful way to when we were talking about what was it called? What were these things called? What was this? Oh, this was the practical syllogism. Remember the practical syllogism? Practical syllogism, right? And the practical syllogism is where we had this universal and particular knowledge at play. And so another way to help us think about how continence and incontinence are acted here, and Aristotle has a discussion in Book 7, chapter 3. I think it's off the top of my head. I might be drawing a blank. And I'm not going to read the text, at least for this particular stuff today. But when Aristotle talked about these two things, that we could see that at any particular moment, if we encountered something sweet, this is just like my pie example, or this time it's talking about cake, right? We can pay attention to one or two dimensions of it. We could pay attention to the sweetness of the cake, or we could pay attention to the fattening nature of the cake, right? And so if my focus is going to immediately been drawn into the sweetness of the cake, and I'm to the point that I'm ignoring this part of myself, it's almost like you can get into this drunkenness of wanting to, of pleasure. That is the kind of action of the continent person. The continent person gets so enthralled when they encounter sweetness, or they're thinking about sweetness, that they would sort of put down this kind of knowledge and not allow it to sort of win out, and the struggle would come from somehow knowing both of these things, right? But the continent person sort of allows the sort of drunken stupor of this to overcome. This is the incontinent person. I was calling this the continent. The incontinent person allows the sweetness of the thing, not the continent. The incontinent, who does the wrong action with struggle and regret, focuses on the sweetness of the thing and lets this become irrelevant to me, and that leads to some regret. Like on the vice versa, the continent person maybe realizes I need to avoid fattening food, and they are able to ignore the sweetness of the thing. Not ignoring it. It's not like they didn't know it, but they sort of push that back, and they keep their desire for sweet things at bay, right? But the truly virtuous person, what would be the truly virtuous person? The truly virtuous person wouldn't have this struggle at all. The truly virtuous person would simply desire exactly the right amount of cake at the right time in the right place. The virtuous person does this with ease and with pleasure. So the virtuous person will eat cake. They'll eat cake, but they'll eat cake in exactly the right time, in the right amount. In the right kind of cake, right, in the right circumstances. They're not going to binge eat on all this cake. They'll do it in exactly the right way. And so even though it maybe is fattening, they're not going to eat so much that'll be an issue for them, right? They're not going to be overcome by sweetness and vice versa, but they are going to enjoy cake because cake is something worth enjoying. So the virtuous person doesn't not eat cake at all. They just always eat just the right amount in the right way. And these are just a couple of ideas of virtues. The virtues of, say, generosity, virtues of what we're going to see is called temperance. And I think I'm actually going to pause this video, and I'll just present some of the examples of virtue in another video, because this guy's already getting kind of long. And so I guess we're going to have 2 more videos on this section. Have a beautiful day, and catch you on the flip side.